Today is Friday, July 25th, 2025. This is Quick Start from CBN News. I'm Dan Andros. Hulk Hogan is dead at 71. We'll have that top story and more on today's podcast, where we bring you news from a Christian perspective. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a rating. You can email us your thoughts as well. Quick Start Podcast at cbn.org. We're getting through the news of the day together bright and early each and every weekday morning. Right here with me today is CBN's Trey Goins-Phillips. A lot to get to on the focus story, Trey. HHS uncovers potential. This is horrifying with our whole organ harvesting scene.
Yeah, we'll break down some of the details. One of the allegations of what happened is absolutely insane. So it's something RFK Jr. is digging into. We'll talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Important details there coming up. On the main thing, how should churches respond to the latest news on the Johnson Amendment? Trey's got more coming up on the main thing on that. All right, make sure you subscribe to all of our CBN News podcasts. You can find the links to them in the description of this podcast episode. We've always got them in there. Make sure you're checking them out. If you haven't subscribed already, we greatly appreciate that. We're going to head now to the news in 90 seconds. And wrestling icon Hulk Hogan has died at the age of 71 after suffering cardiac arrest at his Florida home yesterday morning. Hogan wasn't just a wrestling superstar. He ended up being a cultural phenomenon from the moment he hoisted a championship belt in 1984 after defeating the Iron Sheik. What they called Hulkamania swept the nation. But in his later years, Hogan spoke more openly about his personal faith journey. After physical pain, family struggles, personal failures, including a big scandal that rocked his career, he credited Christ with redeeming his life. In those interviews, he talked about leaning on God through trials and finding peace and purpose beyond the spotlight. Hogan once said, "God has given me a platform and I want to use it to lift him up." In a bold, symbolic move, Israel's parliament passed a resolution calling for full sovereignty over Judea, Samaria, and the Jordan Valley, a territory deeply rooted in biblical history. The 71-13 vote reflects growing public and political will to formalize Israeli control over what many view as the heartland of ancient Israel. While the vote doesn't carry legal weight, it could mark a shift in Israeli policy. Over 700,000 Jews now live in these areas. Those are just some of today's top headlines. You can check out more stories over at cbnnews.com. Man, this was kind of stunning news yesterday, Trey, with Hulk Hogan suddenly passing. I know he's 71. He was having some heart issues, but it's still shocking. And, here's a guy who was really at a low, and he's talked about that openly. And then talked about how God has redeemed him through Christ. And I think it just goes to show no matter where you are or how low things can get, Christ is there to redeem. And, there was a big scandal for Hulk Hogan when he was basically humiliated on camera. There was a sex tape with someone that wasn't his wife, with a friend's wife. It was just very embarrassing and awful. And it was tough for him, but he did publicly lean on God in those situations. And it's just shocking news yesterday.
It's encouraging to know that, we know where his soul is, to know that he had that faith in Jesus and that he used his platform despite all of those ups and downs and those scandals and controversies. And I mean, he's, very public about the difficulties that he's experienced in life, but at least in his later years, pointing to the gospel and pointing to the comfort he has and the solace he finds in Jesus. That is encouraging. It still is certainly shocking, especially for somebody who, just a little over 6 months ago was out campaigning for President Trump. So, I mean, this is a guy who looked to be, we know that he was 70, but he looked to be, relatively healthy. So it just kind of also reminds me of how fragile life is. I mean, one day you can be doing what you're doing, out campaigning and ripping your shirt off, which is like kind of his, I guess, like
right. Yeah, that's his move. Yeah, he'd rip the shirt. Yep.
So anyway, you can be looking that healthy and that active, and then succumb to whatever our bodies can cause us to go through. So yeah, just a reminder of how fragile this life is and how important it is to have your spiritual house in order.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, certainly our prayers go up to the family there, and and everything that's going on, in the wake of losing someone, losing a loved one. So, but like you said, there's peace in knowing where someone is for eternity when they've had that faith. They've placed their faith in Christ, as it appears Hulk Hogan did. All right, we are going to go to the focus story now. And Trey, you mentioned at the top, but this HHS investigation into organ donation. So what is going on here? What sparked the investigation? What was uncovered?
Yeah, so the Health Resources and Services Administration, which falls under HHS, they reviewed organ donation records after there were reports sent to their office of cases, particularly in Kentucky, though they did say that this was really kind of widespread and cropped up in several states around the country, but predominantly in Kentucky, where organ retrieval began even though there were patients who showed neurological activity in their brains, such as how they're breathing, they're moving and responding. This, of course, violates the requirement that donors be legally deceased before an organ procurement can be considered, much less actually start taking place. So there were 351 authorized but not completed donation cases ongoing. The HRSA found 103 of those with troubling features. 73 patients, they ultimately concluded in this report, still showed neurological signs. And at least in 28 cases, organ procurement began before death was official.
I mean, that is just horrifying. It's like, I mean, my goodness, somebody's on there and it's like, hey, maybe we shouldn't do this organ donation. Why is that? Well, because I don't want my organs donated. I mean, the person's essentially alive there. And man, that is just horrifying to think of that. And especially if you don't know, like, I mean, obviously I'm kind of exaggerating saying that they could talk, but like if someone is alive, and I know that
we're going to
get into this, but like, I'm just saying, imagine as we're going through this, you can't speak because of whatever physical impairment you have, but you're getting wheeled into a table here and they're about to harvest your organs and you're alive. I mean, that is just absolutely horrifying. So tell me about some of the most disturbing cases that are being uncovered here.
Well, as crazy as it sounds, what you just described is practically what happened this one man. So as a guy from Kentucky, this actually happened in 2021. But as you know, bureaucracy, it takes a long time for these stories to kind of bubble to the surface and to reach critical mass. And that's what's happening now with HHS. So a high profile 2021 incident that was reported on locally at the time, but it is just now kind of getting widespread attention. A man showed signs of life, even crying and physically, he wasn't saying words, but he was crying and physically resisting what these doctors were going in and doing while he was being prepped for organ removal. So the surgical team paused, of course, what they were doing, and he survived. And then another case involved a guy who was 36 years old. His name is Anthony Hoover II. He began thrashing around and is shaking his head before life support was finally halted. And he was, this guy is alive, so we can take him off life support. We can't harvest his organs. So just absolutely, this is nightmare material, Dan.
It is. And it makes me think, Trey, how many people, those are the ones that survived it. What if they were showing some signs like that, or maybe there are signs like they were alive, but they couldn't quite make it as obvious, right? They were maybe paralyzed in some way, shape, or form, but with it on the inside and trying to alert them and couldn't do it. I mean, it's terrifying to think of. So what reforms are proposed or being implemented, and what's next?
Yeah, so HHS Secretary RFK Jr., he's ordering, of course, some sweeping reforms after the conclusion of this report from his department. So he's ordering, among other things, these several reforms, which is empowering any staff member to pause a donation if there are any safety concerns that arise. And obviously, a patient starting to thrash around and cry and resist, I think that meets that criteria there. Requiring enhanced neurological assessments and stricter consent protocols before even considering harvesting organs, why that was not already something that was required to do neurological tests is crazy. And maybe they were required, but it wasn't as explicitly laid out as RFK is going to, want laid out moving forward. And then, of course, mandating public reporting of any halting of organ procurement for safety reasons. So these cases will have to be disclosed publicly. So, of course, whenever there's sunlight on an issue, I think people are then naturally going to be a bit more careful because they realize, okay, everybody's going to be able to see this data, so we need to be sure before we go in and try to harvest organs. So those are among several, but those are the three top ones that RFK Jr. is pushing for.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's something I hadn't really even thought of because you think of organ donation and you think this is a good thing, right? Somebody's dying, and so we use their organs to help someone else live. And I've seen this. I actually have friends of ours from our church that this is what they do. They transport the organs. That's their part of the process. They get an alert when someone who's an organ donor has passed and they need to have these organs and transport them to wherever the emergency surgery is going on. And it's so, I mean, some of the stories they tell are just incredibly impactful and emotional in saving lives, right? You're seeing the tragedy on one end and you're seeing the life-saving measures on the other end. But yeah, the process, I hadn't thought of the fact that they're potentially taking organs, because you can't let the organ sit there and die. And then I guess, I mean, I'm not a medical expert, but at some point they probably become no good to then replace and use. So in the order, in the idea of expediency and trying to be prompt and trying to be efficient and making it happen, the fact that some steps could be skipped to really making sure this person is actually dead is, man, it's just a horrifying thought. I really hope that they can get to a place where this is fixed.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, as Christians, we know that this matters because there's value in human life, right? We're innately made in the image of God, so we can't be kind of slapshot in how we're dealing with these things. It needs to be incredibly careful, and of course, just the emotions of loved ones who are left behind. You need to make sure that you've taken, obviously, I mean, it even sounds silly to say, like that you've taken every step possible to ensure this person actually is dead, or at least in a vegetative state, before making a decision like this. So, but I mean, in full transparency, I mean, we've talked about this some on some of the interviews that I've done, but my brother is an organ donor recipient. He received a liver actually this spring. So we're incredibly grateful, our family, for just what a beautiful sacrifice someone's willing to make, and the life, as you said, that it can bring to somebody. He's alive and healthy because of that organ donation. So it's a wonderful thing, but there needs to be some serious steps taken before you commit somebody to making that sacrifice.
Yeah. Right, absolutely, because if they're not actually going to die,
you can't undo it.
Yeah, but there's no going back on that. There's no, we'll give you a refund here. No, that's not how it works. And it makes me think of the Terry Schiavo case too, Trey. I mean, I know you're a little younger, so you weren't alive, I don't think, or you were very young when I was
very little,
when that was going on. But I just remember seeing the videos, and that was a different situation because there was fights over representation and who, there wasn't a clear will and what she wanted. But I mean, to me, it's the same thing. It kind of comes like, cause you could see her, they'd hold something up and she'd move her head and like follow it and seemingly respond to stuff. And her parents were willing to take care of her, and they didn't let it happen. And they ended up basically starving her to death. And so, it's just terrifying to think about, but you're, on the organ donation front. And we just, like you said, need to pray that this thing gets fixed up, because it can be a beautiful thing in the midst of a tragedy, but we got to make sure it's being done the right way. So appreciate you bringing that one to the podcast today, Trey. Important stuff. And we're going to go to the main thing now. And Trey spoke with religious freedom expert Richard Harris on a recent episode of Faith and Culture, where they broke down the Johnson Amendment and the IRS's recent changes to the rule, and how churches should respond now that its enforcement is being walked back. That's today's main thing.
Let's go back a little bit and talk about the basics. So for people who might not be very familiar, what is the history of the Johnson Amendment, and what was the original reason for it being implemented?
Right. Well, thank you for asking. So it's called the Johnson Amendment because it was authored and sponsored by then United States Senator Lyndon Johnson before he was president in 1954. He was serving in the U.S. Senate, and Johnson had just been reelected by, a narrow margin as senator, and he was upset because a church in his district or whatever in his state had published material and other stuff against him, making various accusations. And so he thought that it was not right, or I guess I don't know what his subjective thoughts were, but the idea behind the amendment was that we shouldn't give tax exempt status to organizations that are engaging in politics. So, I suspect that few senators knew where this was going to lead and how far-reaching, the impact on freedom of speech and freedom of religion was going to be. But they passed it. It was an amendment to the United States Tax Code in 1954, and it's been on the books ever since. So the Johnson Amendment says that a 501c3 tax-exempt organization cannot intervene in a political campaign in support or opposition for a candidate.
I think a lot of people would say, like, this law has been on the books for a while, but it has not been always, at least not in recent years, strictly implemented necessarily. But then it certainly has had a chilling effect, others would say. So talk about how in the years since that law has been in place, that amendment has been in place, because you mentioned people at the time maybe thought, well, I don't know how long this is going to last or how far-reaching it might be. But what has the impact been on churches and ministries and Christian nonprofits over the years?
Great question, and probably impossible to measure in a quantitative sense.
Sure.
But from my sense, it's been massive, because most churches in the modern era, the last probably 7-8 decades, most churches in America have sought 501c3 status from the IRS, because when you do that, you get this little stamp of approval that says donations are deductible to the donor. And so it makes it easier and for people to give and easier to raise money if people know that you're 501c3. And so churches have sought after that. The problem with it is they then sort of get hogtied in what they can say when it comes to culture and political issues, or at least they think so. So the chilling effect is that many pastors, elders, boards, many others, they don't even want to come close to losing that tax exempt status. So they don't even come close to politics, and they don't talk about it, much less endorse or oppose candidates. And so if you look historically, churches have always been, before the Johnson Amendment, completely free in America to speak about politics in every way, shape, and form. In fact, in the founding of the nation, scholars have documented that it was the preaching from American pulpits that actually produced the change in America's culture and mindset that led directly to the American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence, and the United States Constitution. Pastors were so involved in the Revolution, they were called by the British the Black-Robed Regiment. So the church has always been directly involved in politics and in culture, and the Johnson Amendment has had a major effect at restricting that, scaring that, causing the Christians to withdraw, feeling like, oh, it's illegal. And if I have a minute to say this, Trey, I think it also has reinforced an unbiblical idea in the church, this concept that we don't deal with politics, we just preach the gospel sort of concept, which is also not sound scripturally, but this Johnson Amendment idea reinforces that unbiblical separation of church and state. And so what's happened now is a very welcome development.
Well, that leads me to a question about your role at Truth and Liberty. And some of the work, a lot of the work that you do there at Truth and Liberty is to educate Christians to come alongside and assist churches in realizing, okay, what is my role here in the community? How can I live out a biblical ethic in a secular world? So what do you view as the role of the church, and how is this latest shift from the IRS away from enforcing the Johnson Amendment, how does that free up the church, in your view, to follow through in what it really is supposed to be doing in the public square?
Yeah. Well, so the role of the church, Christians are called, all of us are called to make disciples of all nations. And so what does it take to disciple a nation? Whatever that is, we should be doing it. And I know that to disciple a nation, you don't withdraw from the nation. That's one thing for sure. And likewise, the Lord told us to be salt and light. And he said that people would see the good works that we do and give glory to God. Well, you know, our nation is in big trouble right now. The world is in deep darkness, and a lot of this is because of this idea that we should stay out of government. Government has so much impact and reach, and it sets a moral tone, and it's just so incredibly important. And believers need to be salt and light in government, and it begins, in America at least, we have this treasured gift called the right to vote. And every one of us as a Christian is actually sitting on the throne of this nation with authority. And by not voting, we abdicate our authority. It's like a king turning over his throne. Well, who would say that that's biblical? That doesn't make any sense. But we take it even further and we say, oh, I'm not going to talk about it. I don't want to offend people. I don't want to, we don't want to drive down numbers in our church or any of these kinds of things. So it's very destructive. I think that Christians, all believers, should seek the will of God in their life and pursue the vocation and activities that are on their heart. At a minimum, it means voting, being informed, and being involved. But some people are actually called to do more, to contribute to campaigns, to spread the word about candidates, to actually run for office and be Christian statesmen and Christian leaders in the realm of government. And so there's really no limit to that. Now, in terms of the church as an organization, stepping into and like trying to control government, that's probably it can get to a point where that's a violation of the different jurisdictions of government and church. We're not called to do that, but we are called to be salt and light, to spread truth, to apply truth and the gospel to every issue. The Bible speaks to every issue of life. I'm going on too much, Trey, I know, but there are so many issues of importance today, like abortion, for example, and we think, oh, that's a political issue. No, it's a moral issue. It's a spiritual issue first. And we should apply truth in every area, including politics.
All right, Trey, appreciate that conversation there. And that's going to leave us time on the podcast this week for one last thing.
All right, we are looking at Colossians 3:23 today. It says, work willingly at whatever you do as though you are working for the Lord rather than for people. Just a good reminder that everything we do is really an act of worship to God.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that one because it really puts in perspective, like, no matter what job you have, like no matter how big or small, I mean, I think there's a tendency to think, wow, man, look at that person doing so many important things. And look at this person and how amazing their life is and what they're accomplishing. But God's put each of us in a situation that he wants us in, and he's prepared good works for all of us. And so don't be frustrated with the spot you're in. Just be looking for how God can be glorified in the midst of that, and how his name can be made great in even the smallest job or even the smallest task that you might be doing. So you'd be surprised at what God can do in those situations. But that's a good spot to leave it this week on the Quick Start podcast. As always, make sure you're getting on over to cbnnews.com and faithwire.com for more news from a Christian perspective. Lord willing, and that creek don't rise up on us. We'll be back here on Monday with more. God bless. See you then.